This is Jennifer Pepito with the Restoration Home podcast. This is the show where we talk about the peaceful path to connected families and restored communities. Each week in the Restoration Home podcast in 2025, we're covering different virtues. And this week, we're talking about the virtue of responsibility. So many of you listening are homeschool moms, and you are feeling the weight of the responsibility of teaching your children language arts. We're kind of getting to a point where we're winding down the homeschool year, entering into spring, and it gets even harder to sit at the table and fill out all those worksheets every day in your homeschool. And so I'd love to just present some ideas for simplifying language arts so that you can really enjoy the beauty of nature as the flowers and the trees are blooming and enjoy your children as well. Why do we teach language arts? I think it's really important for you as a mom listening to have an idea about what the point of language arts is, because it's really easy to get bogged down with buying a curriculum for each level, buying a kindergarten language arts curriculum and buying a first grade language arts curriculum and getting a little bit bogged down with all the bits and pieces of those curriculums. One day in a curriculum might have you diagram a sentence and copy a poem and write out some spelling words and just have a lot of pages. And not every single one of those pages actually needs to be done every day. But it is important to understand what does need to be done, because you'll have such an easier time, maybe even deciding, like, if you're using a curriculum that does have a lot of pages, maybe you can decide, oh, hey, we understand this. We don't actually need to do this page today. We could skip this. And so understanding what you're doing is going to give you so much more confidence as you're teaching your children. So what is the point of language arts? Well, the first point of teaching language arts is helping your children communicate. You love your children and you want them to be able to communicate well. You want them to be able to talk to people and communicate ideas, maybe in a speech or maybe telling someone how to do something. You want your children possibly to go to college and be able to write an essay, maybe even write a book or produce content for a website or a magazine. And so the point of language arts is really all about communication, right? It's all about being able to communicate beautifully and effectively and with clarity. So when you think about it like that, it's actually not as overwhelming as schools and curriculum make it seem, because schools and curriculum are breaking language arts into all of their different pieces, spelling, grammar, composition, punctuation, handwriting. All of these are a part of teaching language arts. And so in a typical language arts curriculum, you might be, looking at different vowel sounds. You might be copying something. They might have you do some sight words practice. There might be a grammar lesson. They might have you, read about different vowel sounds. And some kids are going to need that much practice to learn to read. But I have to tell you, often children, when they are ready, will learn really quickly without quite so much curriculum, without quite so many pages and pages. Now, let me tell you one other thing. Some kids really, really love sitting there doing workbook pages. So if you have a child who just loves doing that and your curriculum requires a lot of workbook pages, it's not such a big deal. But for those of you who are feeling the pressure of, your child might be crying trying to finish all of the pages, or your child might be feeling really overwhelmed by all of the seat work they have, maybe it's wearing your child out. This conversation is especially for you. So the idea is that we want to create effective communicators. That's principle number one. We're creating effective communicators. The best way to do that, the number one thing to do if you want to develop communicators, beautiful, detail-oriented, critical thinkers, great communicators, is to read great books. When you read out loud to your children and you listen to books together and you talk about books together, you're giving them ideas. You're giving them the ability to form sentences. You could read to your young child a little section from a curriculum that, might have a little description, and it'll help them understand what words say. They might be able to finish that or describe it back or fill in the blank on something. But it's not going to hit as deeply as some beautiful writing. For instance, here is just a sentence out of a first grade reading workbook. The fox stood by the brook and looked at jumping fish. So that is going to teach your child to look at a picture and decide something. But if you read Winnie the Pooh out loud, you're going to hear phrases like this: You're braver than you believe, stronger than you seem, and smarter than you think. Or sometimes the smallest things take up the most room in your heart. Or, um, so many beautiful Winnie the Pooh. Winnie the Pooh said, People say nothing is impossible, but I do nothing every day. So fun ideas, deep ideas, beautiful ideas. This is what's going to come through when you read aloud to your children. Now, why not just only give your child audiobooks, or why not just only give your child whatever twaddly readers are available at your local Barnes and Noble? The problem with a lot of that is that many of them are being written for today's values. So if you just pick up whatever the latest reader is, the latest, read aloud book that's at the library and let them read it themselves, many times the values aren't going to be your values. Many times they're not going to highlight what is good and beautiful and true, as it says in scriptures that we're supposed to focus on. And so you can't just rely on like whatever literature is included in a curriculum unless unless you know that it's from a beautiful living books list, unless you know that it's beautiful living books, because so much of what is included in like a modern box curriculum, for instance, is just sort of twaddly read alouds. Um, and then if you're getting maybe a Christian curriculum, it's going to be less twaddly, but it's still not going to be the beautiful literature that you might be reading if you're reading something like Little Britches out loud or Little House on the Prairie. These are books that we read to our children in the Peaceful Press curriculum. So the first step to really develop beautiful communicators is to read aloud, to read beautiful books, and to give your children beautiful books. We actually have free book lists on our website. So you can go to the website and search book lists. There are so many different lists that can help you find beautiful books to read to your children. The Read Aloud Revival has great suggestions, because as you're reading aloud, you're really shaping your children's character. How many ways can we shape our children's character? There's our own actions, our own modeling of behavior. And then there's the books and the movies and the content that we include in our homeschool. And so reading aloud to your children is one of those beautiful ways of shaping their vocabulary skills, their communication skills, but also their character. And that is why we don't actually waste a lot of time in our homeschool on, readers, reading comprehension workbooks, things like that, because we want our children's language arts to be built on a foundation of the best literature. The other reason why reading aloud is better than just giving our kids books to read or just doing audiobooks is that then you can talk about them with your children. When my family was doing the Kind Kingdom curriculum, this is the Peaceful Press European History resource. It aligns really well with Classical Conversations Cycle 2 if you're a Classical Conversations family. And in that curriculum, we read the Chronicles of Narnia out loud together. And as we were reading, it was such a beautiful experience of just enjoying these books together. I was moved by these books. I was, I cried as I was reading those out loud to my children. And so my children, they might have been not as deeply engaged with a story if they were reading it themselves, but with just beginner reading skills. And they also might not have been as deeply engaged with a story if they were just listening to it on an audio. It's easier sometimes to tune things out, especially if you're playing. Like, how often have you had an audio book on and then later on been like, I don't remember what was just read, but in these books, as you're reading them out loud to your children and you are kind of experiencing them with your children and they see how you are moved by them, it actually moves them as well. Your children are going to be a lot more kind of integrated or engaged with the stories as you are, just reading them out loud to your children and then engaging them yourself. They're going to catch on to your enthusiasm for them. I just loved, I don't remember the exact words. I wish I could find them right now, but in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader at the towards the end of the story, and Reapy Cheap is talking about how he will keep swimming until he gets to Narnia, basically to Aslan. He said that if his boat sinks, then he'll keep swimming, and he'll just swim until he dies, basically. But this devotion, like the picture of devotion, the picture of just his desperation to be with God, and that was what the underlying thing of that was. And so that moved me so much to see his devotion, and it moved my children to see me being moved by it. They're paying attention to what we love, and in a sense we are ordering their loves. The other thing about teaching language arts, so the first principle is read aloud to your children. Read from beautiful books, and you can find great book lists on the Peaceful Press website. Just search book lists. We have many free lists, and our curriculum highlight these beautiful books that really put an emphasis on values like diligence and love and respect and kindness and faithfulness. The other thing that we do in the Peaceful Press resources, or the second principle for teaching reading, is teaching language arts, is memorizing. When you are reading out loud from beautiful poetry and verses and memorizing them, that is a great way to kind of work your mind around how beautiful words go together. There's a lot of phonetic awareness that comes from memorizing poetry and reading poetry out loud, but it also, as your children memorize, they're getting a feel for the way words can go together and rhythm. They're developing a wide store of beautiful adjectives and adverbs. And so having them listen to and memorize poetry and verses is another great step in teaching language arts. Another thing that can help you as you're teaching language arts to children is copying from great literature every day. If they copy even just a sentence from a beautiful poem, if they copy a sentence from a wonderful bit of literature, then they're going to have this store of how beautiful words go together. If you're too early asking them to make up their own compositions, if you're acquiring compositions too early, it's going to be a little bit harder for your children to have anything good to write about, because they don't have this store of writing to pull from. But if you, on the other hand, you know, first start with reading beautiful books to them, or reading beautiful poetry to them, and even having them copy some of it, then they're going to have this store of understanding. They're going to be more ready to communicate beautifully themselves because they have read so many beautiful poems. In the Restoration Home community, we had this beautiful poetry pack that we went through last year. We memorized the Apostles' Creed. We memorized some inspirational poems about work, and we memorized some catechism questions. We memorized one of my favorite poems, The Lake Isle of Innisfree, and Hope is the Thing with Feathers. We memorized a beautiful Rilke poem. The Shema we memorized, and we also read God's Grandeur and memorized that. And that is a poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins. It says, "The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil. Crushed, why do men then now not wreck his rod? Generations have trod, have trod, have trod, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, and wears man's smudge and shares man's smell. The soil is bare now, nor can foot feel being shod. And for all this, nature is never spent. There lives the dearest freshness deep down things. And though the last lights off the black west went, O morning at the brown brink eastward springs, because the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods with warm breast and with bright wings. we read that poem as part of our Kind Kingdom European history studies. And reading a poem like that, where it acknowledges that the world is hard and heavy and that there are sad and bad things happening in the world, but it also brings it right back around to the hope that we have in God. And so, as you fill your children's minds with these kinds of poems and have them copy these beautiful poems and verses and quotes through their homeschool years, they're going to have a store, not just of words to say, but of ideas that shape their character and their moral imagination that give them hope even. And this is so different from so much of what is in, a basic literature course from a basic curriculum. So we work through reading aloud, we work through copy work, copying beautiful literature. And in kindergarten, it might just be copying one word a day. In the early years in the Peaceful Press resources, we include tracing worksheets so they can trace these phrases or these poems in print or cursive. And then as they move into being confident writers, because there's a lot of motor skills involved in writing that unless they've done, Nourishing Nurture Kindergarten and the Peaceful Preschool, they might not be ready for longer copy work sessions. But as they grow, we include a copy work workbook in the Peaceful Press elementary bundles that has just poems and verses, and they copy them by themselves with their own writing without tracing. So copy work, but then the other aspects of language arts, the first thing that we have to do as we're teaching our children how to love reading is phonics and how to read. And so in my homeschool years, we use something called Spell to Write and Read. It's based on the Spalding method, which the logic of English and All About Reading are both also based on. I really like the Spalding method. And if you are using All About Reading, I think that's a great iteration of it. It has so much hands on, moving the tiles around because some children aren't quite as ready to write as others. And the Spalding method with Spell to Write and Read required you dictating words as the way that you start with your reading teaching. And so some children need letter tiles for a little bit longer. In the Peaceful Preschool and in Nourishing Nature Kindergarten, we include a lot of phonics activities like tracing letters with glitter glue on them. So the first thing that you do in the Peaceful Preschool is you write out your letters in glitter glue. And so then that becomes a kind of a teaching tool that you can review. Each week we have parents, copy the phonogram in a little tray of salt or in glitter glue and say it as they copy it. So they'll say ah, a, ah as they write the letter A, and there's a model A in front of them. Or there'll be the letter A phonogram card from the Peaceful Preschool that has the glitter glue already dried. So it has this kind of salty, sandy, gritty texture that your child can trace with their finger as they say ah, a, ah. And, as we're teaching reading, we usually teach the letter sounds, not the letter names. It's really easy to learn how to sing the alphabet or say the letters in order. But we want our children early on to know what the letter sounds are so that reading comes easier. And reading comes at a different time for each child. Like everybody is made so differently. And so some children are going to learn to read at 4, some are going to learn to read at 12. I've had children learn to read in the gamut, but all of my children have developed into people who love to read. And so I don't think you need to worry if it's taking a little bit longer. Don't get stressed about it. Just keep going. So we teach phonics through all these different, hands-on opportunities like working on copying letters, working on putting words together. In the Nourishing Nature Kindergarten lessons, we begin working on like phonogram identification, and we work on putting these sounds together. We work on beginning reading skills, and we actually include a chart that helps you identify a whole like what letters your child has mastered. We have this whole chart with all the 70 phonograms on there. And so as your child masters a letter sound or a blend, you can mark that off on the chart. And as well in the Restoration Home community, as well as the Nourishing Nature Kindergarten, we have so many really fun activities for writing. Like for instance, in one of the lessons, we have your child label the parts of a pine tree. So they're going to cut out these little letter words, and there is a key. So they just have to look at the key And so they're actually getting a little bit of sight word practice in there because some kids are going to be stronger with their auditory awareness. And so it's going to be easier for them to sound out words. But if your child is struggling a little bit with auditory awareness, they're going to need a little more time with some sight word practice. One of the things that really helped one of my kids get over the hump of learning to read was we would read, simple readers like the Dash readers or Dick and Jane readers. And if my daughter stumbled over a word, I would write that word down on a flashcard. And then later on throughout the day, maybe 5 minutes at a time, these are really short little spurts. I would just flash that word for her, and that would help her memorize the word. And so that helped her fluency in reading. She started to get faster with her reading as she was able to add some sight words to her repertoire because this particular child, her auditory processing skills weren't super strong. And if you're not sure about your child's auditory processing skills, you can do a little test. You just give your child a series of objects or numbers and see how many they can do. So, for instance, if you're listening, here's a series of numbers: 5, 1, 3, 9, 2. Now, if you can say those numbers back, then you could probably sound out a 5-letter word. But if you can't remember a series of 5 numbers, it's going to be hard to remember a word that has many different phonograms and many different syllables. For instance, for a child who's sounding out the word better, they can say b, t. And then if they don't have good auditory processing skills, by the time they get to the ER, they'll have forgotten the first part, the b, et. And so it's important for those children who are still working on phonogram skills to continue reading aloud to them, continue doing poetry with them, continue playing little games where maybe you clap out a pattern and they have to repeat the pattern, or you say a series of numbers or words and they have to repeat it back to you. There are so many ways that we can strengthen those auditory skills, but don't be surprised if you have a child who's struggling to sound out words if their auditory skills are not strong. And in that case, just give them more sight words to practice. And, like I said, there are so many ways of teaching your children to read. We actually used a lot of Explode the Code workbooks. By the time I got to my seventh child, I was teaching my seventh child to read. I didn't have as much time to do full lessons and all about reading or all about spelling or spell to write and read. And so we brought in more Explode the Code workbooks. And these were so helpful for reviewing word families, decoding words, and it was a workbook that my child could do on their own. It didn't take a lot of explanation. Whereas, some workbooks that you might find are going to take you needing to sit down with your child and read each page with your child. And that's going to be really hard. Like I'm looking right now at a Good and the Beautiful level 1, and I don't know how many lessons this is because it's like a 39-page sample, but this one lesson says homophones, circle the correct homophone in each sentence, 8 or 8. And if you do that with your child and you're doing the same curriculum with all of your levels, not all of your kids are going to be able to read. You're going to have to do that with all of them. But an Explode the Code workbook is really self-explanatory. They most of the time can look at it on their own and fill it out. So if you are homeschooling multiple children, find some simple things like Explode the Code workbooks or copy work in the Peaceful Press student sheets that can help your children be working on things while you're helping other children. So and then just keep working on, the whatever reading curriculum you've chosen, whether it's all about reading or something else. Try to find one that is as simple as possible. And then for spelling, I loved the lists in Spell to Write and Read. And I think All About Spelling has lists like that as well. But as often, if your children are copying every day, they're going to become natural spellers. They're going to have, if they have that good phonics awareness of what letters make which sounds, and then they are copying a lot of words, they're going to spell pretty well. My children have not had to have a ton of spelling practice. We would maybe review a spelling list once or twice a week from Spell to Write and Read in my homeschooling, and they have become great spellers. On top of that, most people now are going to be doing a lot of their writing on computers. And so there are so many resources on computers that can help them: Grammarly, spell check. And, as much as spelling is important for sounding like an intelligent, educated person, it's not necessarily your biggest, your hill to die on. So then as your children grow, what do we do for instance, grammar and writing curriculum? And as I said before, if you are reading a lot to your children, they're copying beautiful literature, they're going to become great writers. I have some of my sons didn't do a lot of writing instruction in the elementary years at all. We did a IEW course maybe for a year or two, and then they became great writers, scored high on the SAT. One, that one of them graduated as a salutatorian, another one graduated in the top or tested in the top 97 percentile on the ASVAB. So my children have been able to become great communicators. One of my boys, like I said, didn't do a lot of writing instruction with this child. We did a lot of copy work. We read a ton as a family, and there were, probably weekly writing, some IEW in there. And this child wrote like a whole series of books as a teenager. Unfortunately, they're not on Amazon right now. I love this series, but wrote a book on how to overcome in a world, finding joy in a world of sorrow was the title of it. And so children who are read to a lot and who end up reading a lot will become good writers. Now, the only thing that's going to stop your children from becoming good readers is too much screen time, because it's really easy to choose screens over writing, or reading, that is, and making sure that you highlight a reading time in your home. So that might be that you set aside an hour a day or something where children are reading. And in the Peaceful Press elementary resources, we kind of have this like free reading schedule where we ask you to include that in the Peaceful Press planners. We have little reading logs that your children can fill out. And so making sure that you are prioritizing time for reading is going to be really important. Keeping them off screens is going to help them develop that love for reading. And then as far as grammar goes, and writing too, using IEW a little bit, Fix It Grammar was a great resource to transition into around fourth grade, because it just helps you diagram sentences. It's very quick and easy. It doesn't take a lot of time. And then using IEW's like American history writing lessons was a great resource to pair with the Peaceful Press elementary resources. Like we were doing the Playful Pioneers, and then we were using American history writing lessons. So it was almost like we were getting a little bit more history instruction, because the Peaceful Press uses literature to teach history. And so it was just reinforcing our history teaching to have these American history excerpts, a little story about George Washington or Abraham Lincoln. And then all you do is you work on developing keyword outlines, and then you write a paragraph based on your keyword outline. So it's an excellent way of teaching your child how to summarize what they've read. And as they are working on that, they're having to add in an adjective, or add in an adverb, or add in a strong verb, or make sure they have, you know, some descriptive words in there, working on punctuation. Then it gives you a really objective way of grading those papers. How many of you as a homeschool mom have struggled with giving your child a grade on their papers, on their narrations? Well, IEW makes it really easy, because it's just a checklist, the punctuation, did you add your prepositions, did you add your strong verbs, did you add whatever the recommendation was for that paper? And so it makes it very objective to give them a grade for the paper. It helps develop those writing skills. And it's not going to be the most entertaining way of teaching writing, but it's a great building block. So you don't have to do it necessarily every year of your homeschool years, but incorporating something like that for a year or two is going to be so helpful. So the basic steps, I'm going to close this down now. The basic steps are reading beautiful books to your children, teaching them phonics, and if needed, adding in some sight words, working on spelling some, and then as they move into third or fourth grade, starting to add more grammar and writing through a simple, easy to use resource like IEW. And all through those years, as you're reading aloud, we highlight narration. So, narration is just telling back what you read. It's just a way of helping your child develop a relationship with the content. Now, narration sometimes might look like them drawing a picture about it, or creating a diagram, putting on a play. It's not always something that they write. And in the early years, it's more likely they're just going to be retelling it orally. But having that be the main focus of your language arts, reading great books, narrating what you read, is going to help your children develop beautiful communication skills. You can get started homeschooling with the Peaceful Press resources, which incorporate these language arts ideas with code Restoration10 to save 10% off your purchase. We'll link in the show notes our link to the IEW resources. We'll link the Explode the Code workbook, as well as my free ebook on getting started homeschooling and the Peaceful Press resources. I hope you've enjoyed this. You can subscribe to the podcast, leave a review. This really helps us get more listeners for the Restoration Home podcast, and we appreciate it so much.